The King of England used a Cold War-era switch to cut his own staff off from the central servers, because he didn't want anyone monitoring what he was about to sign. And the thing he signed? It fundamentally alters who gets what in the House of Windsor, potentially forever. By the time you finish this video, you will understand exactly what Charles did, why he went to such extraordinary lengths to keep it secret, and how it has permanently shifted the financial future of the monarchy. But before we go any further, let me ask you something. Should a king have the power to rewrite the rules of inheritance without telling his own son? Or does the crown demand absolute authority, even over family? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Because this story is about more than money. It is about trust, power, and the moment a father drew a line his heir could never cross. And hit subscribe to Royal Talks TV, because we bring you the stories the palace doesn't want you to hear. It was a freezing Tuesday morning in late 2025. At Sandringham House, the king's private secretary opened a heavy leather dispatch box under a desk lamp in the library. Inside, resting on top of the usual daily state papers, was a single sheet of heavy vellum. 5 lines of text, written in an archaic Victorian code that the royal family's estate lawyers had been using for over a century. To anyone else reading it, it looked like a routine property description for some cottage in Aberdeenshire, but it was not. It was a pre-arranged legal trigger, directing the keeper of the privy purse to immediately freeze the distribution logs of the sovereign's personal investment portfolio. That is where this story begins. With 5 lines of coded text on a freezing Tuesday morning. Now some context matters here. Under an agreement dating back to 1993, the private wills of deceased British monarchs are automatically sealed from public view for a minimum of 90 years. That legal firewall exists specifically to keep the true extent of the crown's personal wealth completely hidden from Parliament and from tax authorities. But the document Charles was working with that morning was not a standard will waiting to be opened after his death. It was an active codicil, designed to alter the distribution of non-crown assets before his death. While he is still alive, while he is still reigning, that distinction is everything. Here is where it gets genuinely strange. Within minutes of the king reviewing this document, the automated security systems in the communications room at Sandringham suddenly shut down. Every terminal screen on the ground floor went blank, except for a flashing red status icon. The IT technicians tried to reboot the local server, but the system refused to accept their administrator codes. The entire estate was under a unilateral digital lockout, and nobody could figure out why. The private secretary demanded an explanation from the security chief. This had bypassed all the standard palace protocol rotations. The staff at Sandringham were completely cut off from the main administrative hub at Buckingham Palace. At first, they thought it was a hostile cyber attack on the estate's infrastructure. That is how unprecedented this was. The mystery was solved within about 10 minutes. When someone did a physical audit of the server room, they discovered that a hardware override switch had been manually thrown from inside the king's private dressing room. Charles himself had used a physical master key, a redundant security tool created during the Cold War era specifically for scenarios like this, to cut the estate's external network line. He did not want his digital traffic monitored by the central palace network while the new legal text was being drafted. Think about that. The reigning monarch was so concerned about his own household tracking what he was doing that he physically severed the internet connection from his dressing room, using a backup system designed for national security emergencies. That is not normal palace procedure. That is someone operating with a level of secrecy that suggests whatever he was signing, he knew it would face serious opposition if anyone found out before the ink was dry. While the network was still dark, the king's personal physician walked out of the private quarters holding a sealed leather pouch. He did not speak to any of the waiting advisors in the corridor. He handed the pouch directly to a courier who was waiting on a running motorcycle in the courtyard. The destination of that courier remained an absolute secret from the rest of the family. The logistics log showed no flight plans or travel manifests had been filed. The institution was operating completely in the dark, with the reigning monarch utilizing emergency personal protocols to move legal documents across the country without the knowledge of his heir. Now, let's talk about what was happening on William's end. While all this was going down, William's office at Kensington Palace flags any unusual activity within the sovereign's private accounts through a shared financial tracking system. By 11 in the morning, the prince's chief financial officer noticed the sudden lack of data flowing from the Sandringham registry. The digital bridge that allowed both offices to coordinate on estate management had been entirely severed from the northern end. William immediately tried to place a direct call to his father's personal mobile line. The call went straight to an automated message saying the device was out of network range, so he contacted the main switchboard at the estate. A senior operator told him that the king was resting and had issued strict orders that he was not to be disturbed by anyone, including family members. That is when the senior advisors in London started to genuinely panic. Because if the king was altering his private estate distribution without the consent of the Prince of Wales, the entire transition plan for the transfer of power was compromised, and here is why that matters so much. The private properties, including Balmoral Castle and Sandringham itself, are held personally by the monarch. They are not state assets, they are personal property. A sudden shift in their future ownership would trigger a massive legal battle within the family. These are not just houses, these are hundreds of millions of pounds worth of real estate, passed down through the family for generations. So, while William's team is scrambling in London, Charles is sitting in his study, a large room with green silk wallpaper and family portraits on the walls, at a small writing table by the window, watching the rain beat against the glass. On the table is an open leather ledger from 2024, detailing the precise yields of the family's duchy land bank. He dips his fountain pen into a bottle of black ink and starts writing the final adjustments to the inheritance schedule. The clock on the main tower strikes noon. By this point, the courier on the motorcycle has already cleared the boundary gates of the estate, heading south toward a private legal office in Norwich. The document he is carrying will ensure that the institutional decisions made over the past decade can be legally rewritten before the end of the day. Now, the financial records involved here are astonishing. They list specific offshore holdings that have never been brought into the public domain. We are talking about corporate bonds and blue-chip equities purchased during the late 20th century, completely separate from the land-based wealth of the Duchy of Lancaster. For 30 years, the internal allocation of these specific funds had been handled by a small, trusted committee of trustees, meeting twice a year in Edinburgh, 3 decades of private wealth management happening entirely outside public view. And now Charles was redirecting it with a few strokes of his pen. William's legal team in London immediately convened an emergency session in the basement offices of the High Court of Justice. They started pulling the historical charters governing the separation of private royal funds from state assets. Their concern was straightforward. If the king chose to divert these offshore accounts away from the primary line of succession, the financial independence of the future monarch would be severely diminished. The tension got even worse when a secondary confirmation came through from a banking contact in Zurich. A transfer of ownership form had been submitted digitally to a private Swiss depository just minutes before the network went dark at Sandringham. The transfer involved a highly valuable cache of historical gold bullion, held in trust for the descendants of King George V since 1936. This sudden global movement of wealth pointed to something much bigger than a standard family disagreement over an inheritance. This was a targeted, systematic dismantling of specific institutional reserves. The king was using his unique legal status as a sovereign to bypass the standard asset preservation agreements that had bound the family together for generations. He was not just tweaking the will, he was restructuring the entire financial architecture of the monarchy. Back at Sandringham, the private secretary managed to re-establish a single analog phone link to the Home Office. He spoke in low tones, shielding his mouth with his hand to prevent anyone in the hallway from overhearing. He reported that the king's internal security detail had locked the doors to the upper floor, refusing entry to any palace staff who did not possess direct clearance from the physician. That detail, the medical team policing access to the legal documents, sparked rumors among the domestic staff that the king had discovered an old unexecuted directive from Queen Elizabeth II regarding the distribution of the family's private jewelry collection. If that directive contradicted his current will, it would explain the sudden necessity for an immediate amendment. William resolved this by cross-referencing the ledger codes with his own private copies of the Windsor Accord. What he found confirmed the rumor. His grandmother had indeed left a specific codicil in 2021. That allowed the reigning monarch to unilaterally reallocate certain non-state assets in the event of an exceptional family crisis. Charles was not breaking the rules. He was using an emergency escape clause his mother had created specifically for him. But that resolution only amplified the danger of the situation. By activating this specific clause, the king was formally declaring an internal institutional emergency. That move gave him absolute legal authority to rewrite the future of the private wealth. Without parliament, without the cabinet, and completely without his heir's approval. The motorcycle courier arrived at the Norwich legal office at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He handed the leather pouch to a senior partner who was waiting by the door with a mobile notary stamp. The signatures were verified against the master registry within 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That is all it took to make the amendment a permanent, legally binding reality that could no longer be altered by any court in the land. The rain finally stopped at Sandringham, leaving the brick paths wet and glistening under the gray Norfolk sky. The king closed his ledger, replaced the fountain pen at its stand, and stood up from his table. The silence inside the building remained absolute. Now, let's cross the Atlantic, because this story has a second location, Montecito, California. Hours after the network lockout occurred, a duplicate copy of the Norwich Amendment landed on a sleek granite kitchen island. A personal assistant in a gray uniform carefully sliced through the thick security tape using a silver letter opener. It was early morning on the West Coast. The paperwork inside was stamped with a unique alphanumeric registry code from the Norfolk County Court. The top sheet did not have the standard decorative heraldry of the royal household. It looked like a cold corporate asset reallocation order, and the document directly targeted the inheritance structure of Prince Harry, completely dismantling the remaining financial provisions set aside for his lineage in the United Kingdom. The baseline facts of Harry's financial arrangements are rooted in a series of trusts established by his great-grandmother in 1994. Those funds were legally structured to distribute millions of pounds in dividends once the prince reached specific age milestones. Publicly, the palace had always maintained that these private family trusts were legally separate from the crown's operational funds, and therefore immune to sudden institutional penalties or political adjustments. The document that arrived in Montecito proved that was not true. When the assistant flipped to page 14 of the amendment, the text explicitly altered the residency requirements for all future trust payouts. Under the new rule, any beneficiary who maintained a primary tax domicile outside the British Isles for more than 5 consecutive years was automatically disqualified from accessing the core principle of the trust. The money would instead revert instantly to the general pool of the Duchy of Lancaster. The 5-year marker was a precise, calculated threshold that aligned perfectly with Harry's departure from active royal duties in 2020. That timing is not a coincidence. It is a deliberate retroactive penalty, engineered by the estate lawyers to create a total financial severance. They did not just change the rules going forward, they wrote the cutoff date to match exactly when Harry left. A secondary clause on the same page introduced a tight non-disclosure mechanism. The text stated that any legal challenge brought against this specific amendment by a disqualified beneficiary would automatically trigger a full publication of all private financial audits relating to their post-royal commercial ventures. The message was crystal clear: stay quiet or face a full institutional exposure of your business ledger. It is a gag order written into a financial document. You challenge the will and suddenly every detail of your private business dealings becomes public record. Harry's legal representative in London received a secure digital copy of the filing at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She immediately requested a clarification from the king's personal estate planners. She was told that the amendment had been executed under the Sovereign's Personal Property Act, meaning it operated completely outside the jurisdiction of standard family court reviews or public arbitration. There was no court she could appeal to. The king had used a legal framework that put this decision beyond review. Then she checked the appended schedule of assets and found something even more specific: a line item involving a historic diamond and ruby tiara originally gifted to Diana by a foreign head of state in 1981 had been entirely removed from the family inheritance listing. That piece had been legally designated for Harry's children since the late 1990s, but it was now completely absent from both the Crown Registry and the private estate inventory. She cross-referenced the item number with an older property log from Clarence House, and discovered what happened. The tiara had not been sold or hidden. The king had quietly reclassified the piece as an official diplomatic gift rather than personal property. By doing so, he legally transferred the item into the state collection at the Tower of London, ensuring it could never be exported, inherited, or utilized as collateral for private loans abroad. He did not take the tiara away from Harry's children directly. He reclassified it, so it was never theirs to begin with. But the jewelry situation opened a much larger problem regarding the family's private archives. The amendment contained a small footnote referencing a collection of private letters written by Harry during his teenage years at Eton College. These letters are currently stored in a climate-controlled vault beneath the library at Sandringham. The new document officially transferred their legal copyright directly to the office of the Prince of Wales. That move gives William absolute control over his brother's early personal history. Under British copyright law, the owner of a physical letter controls its physical possession, but the writer retains the publication rights. Charles had effectively stripped that right away, creating a legal structure where William could block the publication of any future memoirs or documentaries that utilize quotes, excerpts, or descriptions of those early family interactions. Harry cannot even quote his own teenage letters without potentially facing a copyright challenge from his brother. The assistant in Montecito dialed a secure international line to update Harry on the contents of the pouch. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, ending with an order to securely store the paperwork in a home safe. No immediate public statement. No emotional response. The scale of the legal maneuver required a completely calculated approach. The financial independence that the California branch had worked to build since 2020 was suddenly being tested by an old-world legal apparatus that they had no power to challenge. The king had not used his voice or his public authority to penalize his younger son. He had simply allowed his pen to adjust a few lines of property code on a rainy Tuesday morning, creating a lasting barrier that would dictate the family's financial reality for decades to come. Back in London, the news of the Montecito delivery caused a quiet ripple through the high-end legal firms that specialized in royal estate management. Everyone in that world understood what had just happened. An institutional line had been permanently crossed. The palace was no longer trying to manage the family rift through public relations or temporary adjustments. They were using the absolute authority of property law to enforce total compliance and absolute silence. The clock inside the office of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster struck 3. The legal teams finalized the registration of the new deeds, locking them into the central archive vaults where they would remain completely hidden from the public eye. But the story does not end there, because William was not just dealing with the legal fallout from London. He got on a helicopter. The twin-engine helicopter banked sharply over the waterlogged fields of Norfolk, its rotors chopping through the heavy rain. William sat in the rear cabin, gripping the edge of a plastic clipboard, watching the navigation screen as the pilot received a sudden radio message from Regional Air Traffic Control. The aircraft was ordered to abort its planned flight path to London and descend immediately. The pilot adjusted the controls, steering toward a concrete landing pad near the northern boundary of the Sandringham estate. This was not the standard arrival protocol for a senior royal visit. Usually, the prince's travel required 48 hours advance notice to the local police force and a full security sweep of the perimeter road. This landing was entirely unscheduled, triggered by an emergency signal sent directly from the king's medical team. Here is some crucial context about Sandringham's legal status. The estate's geographic jurisdiction is fixed by a historical property agreement from 1902. Sandringham is completely private land, bought personally by Queen Victoria for her heir. Unlike Windsor Castle or Buckingham Palace, the property does not belong to the Crown Estate Corporation. The reigning monarch possesses absolute legal authority to bar any individual from entering the grounds, including the next in line to the throne. William was flying into a property where his father could legally have him removed. The tension climbed as William stepped out of the helicopter before the rotor blades had fully stopped spinning. A protection officer held a large black umbrella over his head, but the wind was driving the rain straight across his face. He walked rapidly toward the rear entrance of the main house, where a senior land steward was waiting by the door. The steward looked visibly nervous, his hands tucked deep into his wax jacket pockets. He informed the prince that the king's personal physician had issued a strict medical isolation order for the entire upper floor. No family members were permitted to access the private apartments without a signed clearance certificate from the medical board. William pushed past the steward without saying a word, heading straight toward the grand hallway. The central elevator, which had been installed during the renovations of 2022, was completely deactivated. The digital display panel showed a system error message indicating that the power supply had been cut from a breaker switch located inside the king's private study. William was forced to take the oak service staircase at the back of the building. When he reached the top landing, he found a pair of heavy, iron-reinforced security doors closed across the main corridor. These doors were a defensive installation added to the house in 2023 following an international security review. They could only be locked or unlocked via a biometric keypad that required the thumbprint of either the sovereign or the head of the Metropolitan Police Royalty Protection Command. William pressed his thumb against the glass scanner. A sharp red light flashed twice, followed by a low electronic tone. His biometric access had been completely erased from the local system registry within the past 2 hours. Someone had intentionally stripped the Prince of Wales of his emergency entry privileges inside his own family's private residence. William called the duty officer at Scotland Yard Central Command using his secure mobile link. The officer explained that the access change had not been ordered by police command. The modification was executed directly from a master administrative terminal located inside the office of the keeper of the privy purse. The king had used his sovereign prerogative to issue a direct administrative warrant, temporarily superseding the standard security hierarchy. His own father had locked him out of the house. Looking through the narrow glass viewing slit in the security doors, William saw the private secretary walking down the inner corridor, carrying a locked leather dispatch case with a blue customs tag attached to the handle. The blue tag signified an international diplomatic transit item. That meant the documents inside the case were not destined for a standard legal archive in London or Norwich. They were being prepared for immediate transport to a foreign jurisdiction, potentially an overseas territory or a crown dependency like the Isle of Man, where asset protection trusts operate completely outside the reach of standard United Kingdom high courts. William knocked sharply on the glass panel, catching the private secretary's attention. He stopped, looked at the prince through the glass, and shook his head slowly. He did not open the door. He held up a single piece of paper showing a signed executive order bearing the king's personal signature and that day's date. The text explicitly commanded all staff to maintain total operational silence until the document left the estate boundaries. The prince realized that any further physical confrontation would create a massive institutional scandal among the household staff. He stepped back from the security door and walked down the stairs to the ground floor library. He sat at a large mahogany table, opened his laptop, and accessed the secure registry of the Duchy of Cornwall. He pulled up the historical charters governing the separation of private royal properties. The math was becoming clear. If his father chose to move personal assets into an overseas trust, William's future financial independence as king would be tied to conditions set by a dead monarch's executives. He would not inherit wealth. He would inherit restrictions. The rain outside began to clear, leaving a heavy fog rolling across the Norfolk parkland. A black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to the side entrance of the house, its engine idling quietly in the damp air. William watched from the library window as the private secretary stepped into the back seat, holding the leather dispatch case tightly against his chest. The car drove off toward the main highway, heading directly toward a private military airfield near the coast. The timeline for an internal family negotiation had completely run out. The king's last-minute amendment was no longer an internal palace dispute. It was a legally active, physically secured reality, moving beyond the geographic borders of the United Kingdom. Now, we need to talk about the three witnesses, because this is where the legal machinery really becomes undeniable. The clock on the library mantelpiece struck 4. As three individuals walked into the ground floor conference room at Sandringham, they did not sit down at the large oval table. Each person carried a small leather-bound notebook and a black fountain pen. The room smelled of beeswax and damp wool from their coats. Outside, the fog had completely blanketed the formal gardens. The identity of these three individuals was determined by a strict constitutional protocol established during the reign of King George V. Under British law, a sovereign's private will amendments cannot be witnessed by family members, palace employees, or anyone who stands to benefit from the estate. The individuals chosen were a senior judge from the High Court, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Norwich, and an expert in constitutional history. The legal framework for this meeting is rooted in the Wills Act of 1837. The statute requires that all witnesses must be physically present in the same room at the same time to see the testator sign the document. Each witness must then sign the paper in the presence of the testator. The palace legal team had insisted on strict adherence to these rules to prevent any future challenges in the probate courts. They wanted this airtight. William entered the room from a side door holding a printed copy of the Wills Act Amendment Regulations from 2024. He did not offer a traditional greeting. He walked straight to the head of the table and laid the document down with a sharp slap. He stated clearly that any amendment dealing with the reallocation of historical family heirlooms required a secondary certificate of verification from the Victoria and Albert Museum. The judge looked at the paper, then looked up at the prince. She explained that the king had already secured that specific certificate during a private audience in London 3 days prior. The legal paperwork was entirely complete, leaving no room for a procedural intervention from the heir's legal office. William's team had been completely outmaneuvered on the administrative front. The private secretary carried the master copy of the amendment into the room, placing it on a small wooden reading desk in the center of the space. The document was 3 pages long, bound with a green silk cord, and sealed with the private signet ring of the House of Windsor. The space for the signatures was entirely blank, waiting for the formal process to begin. Then the professor noticed something on the back page of the text. A small blue ink stamp reading, Registry Office of the Duchy of Cornwall, was visible near the bottom margin. That stamp indicated that a portion of the assets being redistributed belonged to the prince's own estate rather than the king's personal portfolio. William had not authorized any transfer of his duchy assets to an outside beneficiary. He demanded an immediate halt to the proceeding until his own financial director could review the asset register. The atmosphere in the room became incredibly tense, with the Duchy Chancellor refusing to open his ink bottle until the discrepancy was explained. It appeared the king had overstepped his legal boundaries. This was resolved within 5 minutes when the private secretary pulled a secondary folder from his briefcase. He showed the room a signed property exchange agreement dated 2023. During the restructuring of the royal residences that year, William had signed a routine administrative cross-lease for a block of land near Highgrove. He had not realized that a hidden subclause in that lease gave the reigning monarch the reciprocal right to reallocate an equivalent value of non-land assets in the event of a family restructuring. The land lease trick left William without any further legal ground to stand on. His father had used a standard piece of estate paperwork, something William himself had signed without reading the fine print, to secure a permanent, unbreakable lever over the family's private wealth. The prince stepped back from the reading desk, his face tight. Charles walked into the room at exactly 20 minutes past 4, leaning heavily on a silver-topped walking cane. He did not look at his son. He walked straight to the reading desk, took his glasses from his pocket, and sat down in the wooden chair. He picked up his fountain pen, dipped it once into the inkwell, and signed his name at the bottom of the 3rd page. The 3 witnesses stepped forward in a silent line. The judge signed first, followed by the chancellor, and finally the professor. Each signature was accompanied by a small physical wax impression from the Sandringham state seal. The entire process took less than 3 minutes, conducted in absolute silence, without a single word spoken between father and son. The moment the final witness finished signing, the private secretary picked up the document and placed it back inside the leather dispatch case. He locked the brass clasps with a small key attached to his watch chain. The paper was now a permanent, legally active reality that could no longer be touched by any family court, parliamentary committee, or future monarchical decree. Charles stood up from the desk, adjusted his coat, and walked back toward the elevator doors, which the security team had turned back on. He left the room without making a statement, leaving his witnesses to pack up their notebooks and prepare for their departure back to Norwich railway station. William remained in the library alone as the black sedan carrying the witnesses pulled away from the front steps. He looked down at the empty reading desk where the pen still sat in its stand. A small sheet of blotting paper remained on the green leather desk mat, bearing the faint, reversed impression of the king's signature, still dark with fresh black ink. The administrative framework of his future reign had been permanently shifted within the span of a single afternoon. Then the phone rang, the internal phone system in the library, a secure line connecting directly to the private apartments at Buckingham Palace. The caller was the keeper of the privy purse, who had just received the automated digital confirmation that the Sandringham registry had been updated. He reported that the main accounting terminals in London had automatically locked down 3 major overseas investment files as a direct result of the king's signature. William picked up the receiver and listened to the financial breakdown. The blocked files contained the liquid capital reserves for the Duchy of Lancaster, the massive estate that provides the reigning monarch with an independent income. By locking these files under a conditional trust amendment, Charles had ensured that his successor could not access the core capital without meeting specific, highly restrictive management conditions drafted by the Norwich legal team. The Duchy of Lancaster's wealth independence was established during Queen Victoria's reign. She insisted that the private funds of the sovereign must remain independent of parliamentary control, to protect the family from political interference. For over a century, that independence was used to maintain the various royal residences and fund the private lives of the extended family. Charles turned that historic shield inward, using it as an absolute check on his own family's financial future. When William opened the desk drawer to look for duplicate registry logs, he found a small red leather diary from 2024 that his father had left behind. Inside the back cover, taped beneath a list of estate phone numbers, was a physical bank statement from a private depository in the Isle of Man. The statement showed a balance of exactly 0. A massive chunk of the family's private offshore wealth had been completely emptied from the account just 24 hours prior to the signing. William demanded an immediate digital trace from his financial team in London. He needed to know where the capital had been transferred before the dispatch case reached its final destination. The mystery was resolved within 10 minutes. When a secure fax arrived on the machine in the corner of the library, the document was a transfer confirmation form bearing the official stamp of the High Court of Justice. The king had not hidden the money or sent it abroad. He had legally transferred the entire offshore balance into a permanent, independent endowment fund, dedicated exclusively to the maintenance and restoration of the historical state apartments at Windsor Castle and Holyrood Palace in Scotland. By tying the private wealth directly to the physical upkeep of state buildings, Charles had made it legally impossible for any future monarch to divert those specific funds into personal accounts or private family settlements. The money was permanently locked inside the walls of the institution itself, protected by an unbreakable legal covenant that could not be reversed without an act of parliament. William looked out the window as the fog began to lift from the gravel driveway, revealing a line of staff members waiting by the side entrance. The domestic workers, the estate managers, the security detail, they were all moving with a quiet, careful hesitation. The realization had spread through the lower levels of the house that the traditional lines of authority had been fundamentally altered in the span of an afternoon. The palace had fallen completely silent because the old rules of compromise no longer applied. The relationship between the sovereign and the heir was no longer governed by unspoken family agreements or shared institutional goals. It was now governed by the cold, precise language of property deeds, trust clauses, and biometric access restrictions. That left absolutely no room for personal negotiation or emotional appeal. William closed his laptop, packed his papers into his briefcase, and locked it with his own private code. He walked out of the library and down the grand hallway, passing the portraits of his ancestors that lined the walls. He knew that when he eventually inherited the throne, he would be stepping into a financial structure that had been systematically redesigned to limit his personal freedom of action. A lasting parting gift from a father who chose the preservation of the institution over the harmony of his own house. He stepped back out onto the concrete landing pad where his helicopter was waiting, its engines idling quietly in the cold Norfolk air. As the aircraft lifted off into the gray afternoon sky heading back toward London, the prince looked down at the sprawling red brick silhouette of Sandringham House below. The building looked completely still, an absolute monument to a historical family that had just redrawn its own internal borders in total, unbreakable secrecy. The silence settling over that Norfolk estate marks a permanent turning point in the financial history of the House of Windsor. By utilizing an old-world legal apparatus, Victorian codes, Cold War kill switches, sovereign prerogatives, and hidden lease clauses, King Charles has fundamentally redrawn the lines of inheritance and institutional leverage behind closed doors. And the consequences of that rainy Tuesday morning will echo through this family for generations. So now you know the full truth behind that extraordinary day at Sandringham. You know what Charles signed. You know why he did it. You know how it has changed everything. But what happens next involves someone we haven't even talked about yet, and that story might be even more surprising. If you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell for Royal Talks TV. Because stories like this don't stay buried for long. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Should a king have the power to rewrite the rules of inheritance without telling his own son? Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.